Hello and welcome to Taking the Scenic Route, Scenic Regional Library's bi-weekly podcast. I'm Steve Campbell, the library's director. Our podcast provides listeners with a closer look at the library, including interviews with upcoming program presenters, information about new and existing services, interviews with authors, book recommendations from our staff, and much, much more. So let's jump right in and get started. My first guest is Jake Little. He is an advisor and career navigator at East Central College in Union, Missouri, and he will be presenting Understanding AI, a Practical Introduction at our New Haven branch on Thursday, June 26th at 6 p.m. Jake, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be here.
So as I mentioned in the introduction, you are an academic advisor. How did you go from being an academic advisor to having such an interest in artificial intelligence?
Well, actually, the interest came first. So I'm a writer and a writing instructor by trade. And so I've been following it for a while. So if you remember ChatGPT when it got released was ChatGPT 3. Well, there was a 1 and a 2. And, so I've been following it roughly about 10 years since the first one came out, just because I was curious about this thing that seemed to be, writing relatively well. And I was interested to see how far does this technology go and what impact will it have on my field as a writer and writing instructor. And obviously now it has a big impact in terms of writing instruction, in that we're seeing a lot of that stuff show up in classes from students. We're seeing a lot of that for teachers in terms of lesson planning and idea generation for activities in classes. We've even seen nationally that some teachers have gotten in trouble for running their students' work through AI to give feedback and grades. So it's a thing that we're really paying attention to here at East Central College for those reasons. But I'm also a career navigator here. So I'm thinking about the jobs. Part of my job is to counsel my students who come through and have some semblance of an idea of what's coming up. What are their concerns? And one of their biggest concerns right now is, how does AI affect the job market? How does it affect the career that I'm going into, the major that I'm doing? And so it's part of my job to consider the answer to that question and try to have some answers for them.
Okay, well, before we even get started on this, I think we've jumped ahead a little bit.
Yeah.
So for people who have only heard of artificial intelligence or AI, but have no idea what it is, can you give everybody a little quick overview? I know you mentioned ChatGPT and things like that, but can you give a quick overview as to what we're talking about for people who might not know?
Absolutely. I do think this is a difficult question, maybe more difficult than people realize, because AI means a lot of different things for different people. I think one of the first things that's worth doing is killing, the biggest myths or ideas about what it isn't. So it's not a giant Excel spreadsheet that remembers the internet verbatim. It's not just a fancy word for any old algorithm. And it's not Skynet plotting world domination while we sleep. It's less spooky, more boring math, just done at industrial scale. So I think the way to think about it is it's think about every pattern finding trick we know: statistics, probability, neural networks, and then feed them oceans of data, oceans of information, and let computers learn their own shortcuts instead of us hard coding rules. So the result is this pattern predicting engine. So it sees enough information, it sees enough cat photos to finish your sentence. This is a ... with cat, enough English to guess the next word in a paragraph, enough driving footage to keep a car between the lines. So, AI is autocomplete at its most simplistic level, but the reason why we're paying more and more attention to it is it's autocomplete for more and more of our reality, not just a Word document or a text.
So where does AI, so if I've used ChatGPT before. So you ask it a question and it gives you information. I can say, give me a sample policy on petitioning in front of the library. And then it goes out and pulls all these policies, gives me many policies that I can then look through and use potentially to create a policy for the library. So where does AI get its information? Where does it produce that information from?
So I think there there's actually more answers to that question than a lot of people realize. So ChatGPT is originally what we call a large language model, an LLM. And so these large language models are trained on data, and they're fed just tons and tons of data, largely, basically every piece of text they can feed these things. And they are trained to reason through your prompt, the thing you type into it, to predict the next best word given the context of your prompt as well. So think of these things at their core like incredibly sharp, capable con artists. They don't really know what they're saying, but they know it's probably what you want to hear based on all the other text they've seen and interactions they've been trained on. But we're largely past just that lone stage of tech. So ChatGPT now isn't just a large language model. It doesn't just use that technology anymore. They also have thinking models, or reasoning models, as they're calling them. And these can take some time to run through possible answers, that the con artist version of itself might have given. So it let's say it generates 10 of these things, and then it chooses the best answer from those options. So it's running a sort of search on its own outputs. Given a little bit more time, it's actually much smarter, much more capable of answering those questions thoroughly. But that's just one thing that they're doing. They also have multiple models running simultaneously. So when you ask ChatGPT a question, it's not just one model. This is called a mixture of experts approach, where they have models that are like particularly good at different skills. So think mathematical reasoning, logical reasoning, spatial reasoning, creativity, any number of skills, so on. And then there's a central model that takes your prompt and decides which other models it should run your prompt through in order to get the best answer. So it's funneling out your prompt, your text that you put in, through these other experts, AI experts that are particularly good at one particular type of reasoning. But they also have tool usage. So modern AI bots like ChatGPT are given access and ability, to use digital tools. So they can play through complex video games. They can search the internet. They can complete CAPTCHAs. They can log into websites. ChatGPT's version of this is called Operator. So all these models are, at their core, they're trained on this giant mass of data that has a cutoff, a date cutoff range of when they stop training it. So, if you query ChatGPT, out of the box right now, it thinks it's 2024 still. If you want newer information from the tool, then it will need to use its own search tool to actually search the internet and browse websites like you or I would. So there's a lot of complex different ways that ChatGPT answers your queries, and there will probably be more complex ways that the scientists, the technology guys working on this will come up with to get better answers going forward.
Okay, so when I search Google, it often uses AI, and it'll pop up an AI answer, and it'll give sources actually, and tell me this is AI generated, and it'll give me answers to my Google search sometimes, and it'll give me. If I use ChatGPT, it gives me a policy, no source, of course. So is ChatGPT, for example, is it pulling a bunch of policies and then creating one kind of based on the ones that pulled, or is it pulling an actual policy from somewhere on the internet and it's not quoting the source for it?
Typically, it is not pulling directly from a policy that exists somewhere else on the internet.
Okay.
Typically, what it is doing, if you think of it like a chef who has sampled every spice in the world and is then able to make a new dish from it. It is incorporating all those other policies that do exist on the internet, but it's making something new out of it.
So it's thinking on its own then.
To a certain, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's the right metaphor to use. I don't know that thinking is a one-to-one, but it is doing something very similar to thinking. Something I used it for about 6 months ago was when I was looking for a house. And you get all these disclosure documents, and I'm like, I don't know what I'm looking at a lot of the time. And so I have it scan through these documents to see what are some red flags in this disclosure document? What are some things I should do? Again, it's not that I'm not then going through and reading it myself, but it gives me a starting point for like, okay, what is going on here with this septic pump or this, it gave me a jumping off point.
Mhm.
So yeah, definitely can be useful in those veins.
I know you're not an attorney, but I have heard in the news that there are copyright issues with AI
Mm,
because it's basically using other people's information or a
yeah.
company's information or a person's information. So, what is the latest on that in terms of AI being allowed to use this other information? Or even the information that you input into it, I've heard that it
Yeah.
gets to keep that information. If you scan, like you said, a document and ask it to
Yeah.
summarize it, then it has that in its database.
So I think there are a number of concerns there that we need to keep track of. I think number one, it looks like these companies, I mean, a lot of these copyright cases are still to be decided. So there have been a lot of lawsuits. A lot of them are still to be decided. But to this point, it looks as though OpenAI, who made ChatGPT, Anthropic, who does another product called Claude, even Google, who, has their own AI stuff like Gemini or DeepMind, it looks as though they're winning these cases on the fair use argument.
Hmm.
So, in other words, as long as AI companies are training from and significantly transforming the original content that their product is built upon, they're legally safe on the copyright front. But that's a very different question than what the end user faces on the copyright front. So issues come in when you, the end user, uses this AI and tries to profit from the stuff that comes out of it. So in
Hmm.
other words, the AI itself is not responsible for generating an image of Mickey Mouse. It is not responsible for that. You, on the other hand, if you try to sell that picture of Mickey Mouse that it generated for you, you are liable for basically ripping off the company. That, or at the very least, that is still up in the air, and I would be very cautious about that as an individual user to
Hmm.
try and make money from anything that the AI produces for you. Because again, it is pulling from all these different sources, but when it comes back together, it often resembles very closely something that someone else has created. So the end user, it looks like, is going to be held more responsible for those things
Hmm.
than like these big companies. What else is
Well,
new?
well, let's go on a tangent then, a quick tangent about image
Okay.
generation because
Mm,
everyone on the internet, on social media, and even even on when they're searching things on Google, they get lots of now AI generated images that are not real. I mean, they're obviously memes and things that are being used for maybe nefarious purposes,
yep.
politically or in other ways. And so my question is that does software exist to always 100% of the time detect when AI has been used to generate one of these images?
No. I think that, these companies can do a lot to make it much more difficult. Whether or not they are doing that remains to be seen. I think Google and Gemini has put some like tags and some hidden data in their images to make it challenging or to make it harder for you to get away with a fake image. And it's certainly possible that at some point we will have tools that are more reliable at detecting these things. But I could tell you from the text generation end, we have plagiarism detectors, we have AI detectors as well, and these are slightly more reliable than 50-50. In
Wow.
other words, so the real issue isn't so much when it gives you a false negative, when it says, yeah, this isn't AI and it is. That's a concern, but it's not as big a concern for us anyway, as at ECC or in colleges and higher ed, as when you give a false positive, as when it says this is AI and it's not, right? This happens more often than you think with these detectors because they're looking for particular patterns, and part of what AI is doing is finding the most common patterns and replicating them. So in other words, when the detector sees a really common pattern, then it flags it as AI, even if that's just a normal thing that lots of people do, and that's why the AI does that kind of thing all the time. So For example, we see AI detection tools flag introductory paragraphs to student essays all the time because there's only so much variation that can happen in there, and they have a lot of the same features when you're starting a paper and when you're ending a paper. The middle is where you're less likely to get that false positive, but because there's so many common features at the start and the end, you get these false positives. It's even more common when you see, English as a second language speakers get false positives roughly 70% of the time. And it's because they're taught English in a certain way, and they have to be very formulaic to communicate,
Mm-hmm.
and that formulaic nature means we get some false positives. So it's a really tough time to try and trust any detection tools, whether it comes to images or text.
So that will make the world a challenging place, more
Oh,
challenging because
absolutely.
if every image you see, you don't know if it's artificially generated or not and real, and every video you see, you don't know if it's real, you begin to question everything around you. So I guess they're going to have to work on detection tools. And I think, haven't there been some laws introduced requiring people to designate that something has been, in some states, designate things have been artificially intelligence generated?
I'm not sure. I think that's a smart policy as much as you can follow it. So it's one of the things, like I'm on the AI committee at East Central College, and that is one of the things we're discussing is, okay, we need to be transparent when we use this and when we don't. Look, it's a valuable tool, but you need to know when is it appropriate, and if you do use it, the people engaging with it need to know human, not human. It's
Hmm.
really important. It's really important, particularly if you're a human-facing organization. You know that
Hmm.
it is important to manage human relationships, and I think a lot of students, in particular, right now, are very suspicious that they're not talking to a human all the time. I can't tell you the number of times I've taught an online class, and and then I have a face-to-face Zoom with a student, a couple weeks in, and they're like, "I just assumed I was talking to a robot." The blanket assumption from a lot of our younger students is this is not a human. And I think that it's important to be intentional and open and honest about human, not human. How we navigate that space is going to be difficult.
It's good to know whether or not you're talking to a human or not,
Yes,
I think.
yes.
It's
and
helpful.
and
It's
we've
helpful.
yeah, and we've relied on the fact for so long that it was easy to tell. It is no
Sure.
longer easy to tell. And as you pointed out, the video is getting more and more sophisticated. VEO3 is a tool that Google just released that I think is pretty far along in terms of like producing video of humans. And to this point, one of the biggest barriers, the reasons why a lot of people haven't seen it is it's very expensive to generate this video. But as those costs come down, it does become more and more concerning. I would say to your listeners, it is time to stop trusting on a blanket level the video and the images you see on the internet. It is time to start questioning those things regularly. I understand we already had that. We
Yeah.
already have that awareness. There's a new threat on that front in terms of like what you can trust, what you can't.
And this is a lot better than Photoshop.
Oh, so much better. So much better.
It's better.
And it can be produced at a much higher scale. There's
Yeah.
much less labor involved. Photoshop still takes a really skilled human spending hours to make a thing. We are talking about something that can be made in 30 seconds and with a single prompt.
Now,
So,
now you were just talking about chats on websites and help desk chats and how they're
yes.
actually AI. That kind of leads me to my next question. Can you talk about ways that people listening or people encounter AI now? I mean, I don't even realize they're encountering AI. I mean, it's in every aspect of our life
Yeah.
already. It's not the future,
Yes.
it's now. So can you give me some examples of that?
Oh, sure. I mean, I'm sure your listeners have already encountered this stuff and they may or may not be aware of it. But obviously, like autocomplete, it
Oh
is
yeah.
AI. Spam filters are AI. So if like you have on your phone, you have, listen, if you don't have the spam filter on your phone, you're just constantly getting these spam phone calls. Well, They have AI on your phone that can learn to detect the types of numbers that tend to pop up and can filter those out. Netflix recommendations are AI.
Hmm.
Video games have learning AI. Phone face unlock, Google Maps traffic predictions, phone cameras. I remember there was something of a controversy, 5 or 6 years ago when people found out that Apple had a special program in their phone cameras that when you took a picture of the moon, it would use AI technology to make it look clearer than it actually was.
Hmm.
Basically, it's really hard to take a good high quality picture of the moon, but they knew that enough people did that they were like, let's build a special AI program to do this better. So it's packaged in. So basically every device that
Sure.
you have that runs software of any kind.
Where do you see AI in 5 or 10 years? Like how will it be impacting our daily lives at that point? Are you and also experts predicting?
Well, I think next year or the year after likely won't look that different due to
Sure.
AI. 5 years or 10 years from now, however, I think most of the predictions from people paying attention to this field, is that jobs and work will look very different from the way they do now. I think most people predicting what the world will look like in 5 to 10 years will end up looking like an idiot, though. I think that there's a lot of stuff that can happen and might happen that sounds insane. I was thinking about jobs in particular and how previous technology advances have impacted the jobs that exist. So there have been some jobs that have been wholly replaced, due to technology. So you think about lamplighters, you think about carriage drivers, elevator operators, switchboard operators, milkmen, travel agents. But I actually would argue on some of these that it's not that service has gone away, it's just transformed so much that we don't recognize it anymore. So you think about travel agents, for example. It's not that this field doesn't exist anymore, it just has a lot fewer people in it, and it operates in an entirely different way. So who's working at Expedia and TripAdvisor or Kayak, these online, self-booking websites? This human need still exists, but the responsibility of the worker and the consumer have changed dramatically, as have the skills required to do that work. So in other words, it's not just that things are getting eliminated. Some things also get created, but it's transformed in such a weird way. How could you have possibly anticipated that? Even if you knew about the personal computer before the internet, you still don't see it changing that dramatically or in that particular way. I mean, consider how the nature of office work has changed since the personal computer became widely used. There are a whole new range of new skills, knowledge, and jobs that came along with personal computers. And I expect the same, probably more, will happen with AI. I do think this is a bigger change on the horizon.
Well, I was reading the craziest story. I was reading in the news a couple weeks ago about a company that decided to use AI generated models for their ads instead of
Mm,
actual models. And then I guess there was some kind of protests, and then they decided that they were going to work out a way that the models could be photographed from hundreds of different angles, and then they would use those photographs to generate the images instead, and the actual human models would receive a cut, I guess, a certain amount of money
yes.
for their image being used over and over. But they were going originally, the plan was we're not even going to use humans, we're just going to
Yep.
generate fake humans using AI and use those for our ads. Think about all the people who are models in the world, like all the print
Yep.
advertising and online advertising. If all those people were artificially generated, we're talking about potentially thousands, hundreds of thousands of people being out of work.
Absolutely. And I think I think there are a lot of companies right now that they're attempting to phase out certain classes of workers. Some examples I've seen is like voice actors or translators. Now, whether or not they're being successful at those things, like the example you pointed out, remains to be seen. I think the smarter companies are still keeping things human and they may be downsizing in terms of limiting the amount of workers they have, basically keeping their top workers who are running basically quality control on outputs, So you still need an expert human in the loop. The AI is nowhere near good enough at any one piece of the stuff that it does to be trusted to do it alone. You still need an expert in the loop. But I think another thing that the smart companies are doing isn't actually letting anyone go. It is, okay, we have all these new capabilities. Actually, we can cover more ground if we use this as a tool for our workers. And it frees up some of your additional workers now to tackle another part of the market, to do
Sure.
something else, to expand, to grow, to do something better or bigger. I think people thinking about how this increases your own agency are going to be much more successful than the people in the companies who are using it to sort of shut down and be like, well, I can farm all of my writing knowledge out to this AI now. I think those people are going to be in real trouble. I think they're going to be in real trouble.
Well, Jake, thank you for joining me today. Once again, Jake will be presenting Understanding AI, a practical introduction at our New Haven branch on Thursday, June 26th at 6 p.m. You can register by visiting scenicregional.org/events. Thanks, Jake.
Thank you, Stephen. It's been a pleasure.
My next guest is Dan Viets. He is an attorney in Columbia, Missouri, practices law all across Missouri. He co-authored the book Walt Disney's Missouri, The Roots of a Creative Genius, published by the Kansas City Star. He has also written several articles about Walt Disney's life in Missouri. He is also a member of an organization called Thank You Walt Disney Incorporated. He pointed out to me that he is president of that organization currently. And Dan will be presenting Walt Disney's Missouri at our Union branch on Thursday, June 12th at 6 p.m. Dan, welcome.
Thank you, Stephen. Happy to be here.
As I mentioned, you're an attorney. What led you to becoming so involved with Walt Disney?
Well, like everyone, of course, I grew up with Walt Disney films, television programs, the Mickey Mouse Club, the Sunday night Wonderful World of Color. Those are big influences on all of us, I think. My real deep interest, my obsession, you might say, with Walt's Missouri history began back in about 1990, 1993. I read a book that told me enough about his Missouri years to pique my interest. I spent some time up in Marceline, met some folks up there who actually had known Walt and his family when they lived in Marceline. And over the intervening 30 some years, I've gotten actively involved with the Kansas City organization, which owns and is preserving and restoring the building where Walt Disney's first professional film studio operated. I think my interest in Disney stems from an interest in Missouri history and an interest in film history. The history of the movies fascinates me.
Sure. So, like you just mentioned about the Missouri connection, most people are probably unaware that he ever lived in Missouri. You mentioned Marceline. Can you talk a little bit briefly about where and when he lived in Missouri? I know you mentioned
Sure.
Marceline and Kansas City.
Well, Walt was born in Chicago in 1901, December 5th, 1901. But when he was 4 years old, his parents decided the neighborhood there was too rough, and they moved to the small north central Missouri town of Marceline. Now, Walt's father's brother owned some farmland there. He didn't live there, but he owned some farmland there. So that may be why Elias and Flora Disney chose Marceline. And the Disney family lived in Marceline for 5 years. And that was a very important period of Walt's young life. Some people say he remembered nothing about his years in Chicago, but he forgot nothing about his years in Marceline. He really loved that little town. The family lived on a small farm right on the edge of town. So Walt lived on a farm, but he could walk into town as a little kid. So it was a great environment for him, and he loved Marceline. Marceline had a great influence on both his films and the design of his theme parks in some respects. But at the end of about 5 years, Walt's father had taken ill and wasn't really cut out to be a farmer, apparently. So he sold his little farm and moved the family on the Santa Fe Railway into Kansas City. And that was the beginning of a 10-year period of time that Walt Disney lived in Kansas City. And that's even taking out the 9 months that he moved back to Chicago and another 9 months that he spent in France right after World War I. But a total of a little more than 10 years of his life were spent in Kansas City.
Wow. So you mentioned that Marceline had a big impact on his career in terms of the movies and his theme park. What did it influence exactly?
You can see the influence in early Mickey Mouse films in particular, and some of the Silly Symphony films. You can see the rural influence there of Marceline. You can see in particular in a Mickey Mouse film called The Band Concert, which I believe was the first Technicolor Mickey Mouse film. That appears to be actually in the town square of Marceline. It's not a big jump to say that Marceline was always in the back of Walt's mind, and the days he spent there were idyllic. But it also influenced his design of Disneyland. The first Disney theme park, of course, was Disneyland. When he designed Disneyland, of course, the entryway to Disneyland is Main Street, USA. Well, the Main Street, USA portion of Disneyland is very clearly inspired by and to a degree modeled on the Main Street of Marceline, Missouri.
Wow.
So when you go to the Main Street of Marceline today, you still see a great deal of the same architecture that Walt Disney saw as a young boy growing up there, and you can see in many ways how that architecture influenced the design of Disneyland. One of the specific influences is the Coca-Cola corner at Disneyland. There's a building that's very similar. It has a diagonal corner entrance, a two-story red brick building in Marceline, and through a series of unlikely events a few years ago, because there was a fire, an addition had been built onto this particular building. When it burned and was removed, it revealed a giant Coca-Cola advertisement painted onto the wall of the building right next to it. So we know that Walt would have seen that advertisement for Coca-Cola and made that connection. So it's not far-fetched. It's not a giant leap in logic to see some of the specific buildings reflected in Disneyland's design.
How does Marceline recognize Disney today?
Well, the primary recognition is a beautiful museum that is in the former Santa Fe train station there, a two-story red brick building, 50 by 100 feet. And it is just packed with beautiful Disney artifacts and a truly unique collection that they were fortunate to receive from Walt's little sister, Ruth. Walt had a sister almost exactly 2 years younger than he was. And Ruth, throughout her entire lifetime, and even her children didn't know this until she died, but throughout her entire lifetime, she saved every clipping, every letter, every postcard, every scrap of paper that related to her brother Walt, including drawings he made for the high school newspaper up in Chicago. As I mentioned, he went back up to Chicago for a 9-month period, attended his first and only year of high school there. But she had this incredible treasure trove of Disney family artifacts hidden away in her home. And when she died, she let her son know that she wanted that to be given to the Marceline Museum. She had developed a friendship with the folks who run the museum there, and she knew that was the place where those items would be most appreciated. And so you see those when you go to the Marceline Disney Museum as well. Now, I recommend people call before they go because the museum's not always open. It's open during the summer and a portion of the spring and fall, but it's a good idea to call first to make sure they're open, but it's well worth the trip.
You mentioned that he had just 1 year of high school. Was he totally self-taught in terms of his artistic ability?
Largely. Now, he did attend in Kansas City, he did attend his first art classes at the Benton School on Benton Boulevard. And later, he attended Saturday morning classes at the Kansas City Art Institute. And when he established his studio in our building, the building we're preserving and restoring, he arranged for his employees to attend classes at the Kansas City Art Institute. And today, when young people write to the Disney company and say, I want to be an animator, there are 3 schools they refer them to, and one of them is the Kansas City Art Institute. So
Wow.
KCAI played a significant role in Walt's development as an artist.
So while we're talking about Kansas City, Did that have the same impact on him later with the creation of his theme parks and his cartoons? Did Kansas City have the same influence as Marceline did on him?
I think so. I think it had a very similar influence. Of course, we're all a product of our environment and our
Sure.
experience. But yes, the urban setting of many Mickey Mouse and Silly Symphony cartoons certainly shows an influence from Kansas City. It may be less explicit, less specific, but it certainly is there. Yes, Kansas City, and again, the decade that Walt Disney spent in Kansas City had a major influence on him. It is where he began his career. He began again his professional film career by incorporating a company he called Laugh-O-Gram. And the Laugh-O-Gram company, the records of that company are still in the Missouri Secretary of State's office. And the company operated on the second story of a red brick building at 31st and True, near 31st and True Streets. A new building at that time, brand new building, designed by a noted Kansas City architect whose name was Nell Peters. Nell Peters is very highly regarded today. She was one of the very few independent female architects who ran her own firm. She designed hundreds of commercial buildings around Kansas City, and if anyone proposes tearing one down, they meet with immediate resistance. Well, I'm glad that we were able to resist the effort of the city of Kansas City to destroy the Laugh-O-Gram building. In fact, it was scheduled for demolition when we took it over back in about 1993. I was able to identify and locate the owners of the building. It had been vacant for many years and had deteriorated very badly. Nell Peters had designed several skylights in the roof of that building, and skylights are great for illumination, but they are terrible for structural integrity. And so every skylight in that building had leaked badly and had rotted the wood, and some of the skylights had actually fallen into the building. Some of the second story had fallen down to the first story. The building was in very bad condition, and that's why the city of Kansas City had scheduled it for demolition. And that's despite the fact it's on the National Register of Historic Places. Being on the register doesn't guarantee the building won't be demolished.
Oh, I didn't
So
realize that.
we took it over. We purchased it from its owners. They were highly motivated since the city was threatening to demolish the building. They sold it to us at a very reasonable price, and we set about restoring it and making it structurally sound. And fortunately, obtained an early grant from the Walt Disney family. The Walt and Lily Disney Foundation, operated at that time by his daughter Diane and her 7 children. And they gave us a grant of nearly $500,000, a matching grant. We had to obtain donations of materials and labor from Kansas City builders, and we did so. And that enabled us again to keep that building standing. And that's why it's still there today. And we're proud of that fact, even though it's been frustrating raising enough money to actually restore the building and make it open to the public has required many years. Now, we were fortunate that through the efforts of Congressman Emanuel Cleaver a couple of years ago, he got us an appropriation of $2 million from the United States Congress. And so far, the Trump administration has not withdrawn that money. And so we continue to do restoration work on the building. Our general contractor, Centric Construction, is overseeing the reconstruction of that building's interior. We're putting in, of course, an HVAC system and wiring and plumbing. I mean, other than the shell of the building, very little remains. And so, in a way, that's a good thing because it enables us to start from scratch. Now, we will reconstruct and we will recreate the rooms that Walt occupied. The rooms where his studio operated were on the second story at the west end. The remainder of the building we're going to dedicate to both educational activities and educating people about the history of animation in Kansas City. One thing that is not widely recognized, but is very important, is the fact that the entire Hollywood animation industry can trace its roots to our building in Kansas City. And here's why that's true. When Walt Disney left Kansas City in the late summer of 1923, he had just taken bankruptcy, given up on Laugh-O-Gram, got on the train and rode it all the way on the Santa Fe to Hollywood, to Los Angeles. And he didn't even plan to be an animator at that point. He was tired of animation. He wanted to be an actor. He wanted to be a director, but he soon found nobody was hiring kids from Kansas City to be actors or directors. However, his brother Roy was already out there recuperating from tuberculosis that he had picked up during World War I. And Roy was at a VA hospital. And so Walt had begun a correspondence with the nation's foremost distributor of animated films while he was still in Kansas City. Her name was Margaret Winkler. And he sent her the last film he made in Kansas City, which was very clever innovation in which he used a live action little girl named Virginia Davis and put her into a cartoon environment. So she interacted with cartoon characters, and that had not been done before. And so Ms. Winkler was intrigued with that and gave him a contract to make a dozen more of these Alice comedies. They were called, very loosely based on Alice in Wonderland. And so Walt ran over to the Sawtell VA hospital. Roy, his brother, was still bedridden from tuberculosis. Walt runs in there waving this letter from Margaret Winkler saying, Roy, we've got a contract. We're in the movie business. And they were. And that was the beginning of the Walt Disney Company. As the company counts its beginning, they could say it began in Kansas City, but they count their beginning as the date of that contract, October 16, 1923. And so every year on October 16, the company celebrates its birthday because of that contract to make those little silent black and white cartoons. We still have several of those, by the way, and they are clever and they are amusing, even though folks today aren't used to silent black and white cartoons. They actually are very entertaining.
You mentioned how he was an innovator in terms of having a real person mixed in, I guess, with the cartoons, but was he an innovator in any other way at the time when it came to animation besides that one type of feature?
Throughout his life, he was an innovator. He was always on the cutting edge of technology. He always embraced whatever new technology came along. So he was the first animator to use Technicolor, full Technicolor in his films. He was the first animator to use sound. That was the original innovation, and that was the reason why Mickey Mouse was an overnight sensation, was because Walt managed to put coordinated sound, and that means music and sound effects, as well as dialogue, onto an animated film. Now, when people saw the earliest talkie movies, the sound was very poor quality because they had not figured out how to wire the microphone and put the mics in a place where a live actor could get to the mic. So the mic would be in a potted plant or something, and they have to lean over toward the plant. But in animation, and one of the things that appealed to Walt about animation, you have complete control over all of the technology. And so the sound quality was actually far better on the early animated cartoons than it was in the early live action films. And so Mickey Mouse, November 19, if I recall correctly, of 1928, premiered and again was an overnight sensation. It was just something that people had never seen before. And the cartoons were funny. They were clever. They had spirit, and Mickey himself had personality. And so Mickey was the beginning of Walt's real worldwide fame. The innovations in Mickey Mouse, again, were followed by Technicolor, were followed by, in 1937, by the first feature-length animated film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the first successful feature-length animated film. And Snow White is still a landmark today. It is just an incredibly well-made film. No one probably will ever be able to make an animated film that is as good as Snow White. For many people, Snow White is really the pinnacle of animation.
Mm-hmm.
One of the most important innovations he embraced was television. In the early 1950s, Hollywood, to a large degree, was really worried about what television was going to do to the movies. They were afraid everybody would stay home and watch television instead of going to the movies. To some degree, that turned out to be true. But film survived and thrived. And Walt understood that. Walt embraced television. He put that, what was originally a Wednesday night ABC program called Disneyland, and it morphed into The Wonderful World of Color, which moved to NBC in later years. So most of us remember the color version on NBC on Sunday nights. But at any rate, the show was actually called Disneyland. And Walt was beginning to plan and build Disneyland then. So he used television to promote his theme park. And the idea of even building a theme park seemed crazy to everyone except Walt. I mean, his brother, his wife, his bankers certainly all thought he was just crazy. I mean, what do you know about theme parks? Why would you want to build a theme park? You're in the movie business. And yet Walt showed them that he knew exactly what he was doing. And his design for Disneyland has never been matched or excelled. It is, I think, still the finest theme park on the planet. Now, the Disney company, of course, Walt laid the plans for the Walt Disney World in Florida. It was originally going to be called Disney World. And after Walt died and his brother Roy made a promise on his deathbed that he would follow through and build that theme park in Florida. But Roy made the decision to call it Walt Disney World. And that's why it's named that today. It really is a memorial to Walt Disney. Walt had his hands on every little aspect of Disneyland, but he was only able to take part in the planning and the land acquisition for Walt Disney World. And then, of course, the company has gone on to build theme parks in Tokyo, in Paris, or near Paris, I should say, and a couple of them in China now. So the sun never sets on the Disney empire.
What led Walt from animation to theme parks? That's a bit of a
Mhm.
stretch, obviously.
Yeah, I believe that a theme park in Kansas City had something to do with that. I do not want to overstate this. Walt never acknowledged this influence, but I think it's clear that a theme park called Electric Park in Kansas City had a big influence on his idea of what a theme park could be and his love for theme parks, his love for amusement parks. Amusement parks, of course, have been around for a long time in various forms, and rides are the heart and soul of amusement parks, that is. But the idea that an amusement park could have a specific theme may have begun with Disneyland. Some people point to other examples, but Disneyland clearly was the first example of a highly themed amusement park. And so the theme of Disneyland is Disney's films. They're very closely tied together. There is Adventureland. Well, there are a lot of Disney adventure films. People tend to forget how many great live action movies Walt Disney made. One of my favorites is Swiss Family Robinson. That is an awesome movie, just one of the greatest adventure movies ever made. And so I think of the Swiss Family Robinson when I go to Adventureland and take the Jungle Cruise, which to a degree I think is based on the Bogart and Hepburn film, The African Queen. But at any rate, my point is that each of the lands relates to certain of Disney's films. Fantasyland, obviously, mostly the animated films. Adventureland, as I mentioned, relates to films like Swiss Family Robinson. Frontierland, Walt did make frontier movies, and especially Davy Crockett was really a phenomenally popular character and a series of first television films, and then some of those were released in theaters. So Frontierland relates to Davy Crockett in particular, and Mark Twain, by the way. Mark Twain, another Missouri influence on the park. Mark Twain steamboat runs around the Tom Sawyer Island, and the Huck Finn canoes, rafts rather, go over to the island. So there's a lot of Mark Twain influence there. But even Tomorrowland, relates to a lot of Disney's films because the Sunday night show had a series of programs about space travel and about how space travel was just beginning and was going to be the wave of the future, and really well done. Werner von Braun was involved in the design and the production of those Disney films about space travel, and he was involved in the design of the rocket ship, which stood in Disneyland, in Tomorrowland. TWA sponsored that attraction, and they actually put the TWA rocket on the cover of their flight schedule back in July of 55. That's the month that Disneyland opened.
I mentioned you are a member of Thank You Walt Disney, and you mentioned that they're renovating the building in Kansas City. Is
We
there
are.
any timeline for that museum to open?
We've made so many predictions that turned out to be wrong, Stephen. I just hate to make another prediction. It all depends on when we get the funding, and we are actively seeking additional grant money, but it's not easy. It's not as easy as
Sure.
one might think. The Walt Disney Company has been supportive, but they haven't actually written that check out yet. And I think that many of the philanthropies think, well, the Walt Disney Company has all the money in the world. Why should I give money to save their history? Why aren't they saving their history?
Mhm.
And, it's a fair question. I have had conversations with Michael Eisner, with Roy Disney, Walt's nephew when he was still with us, and others at the company about, including Bob Iger. So I think at some point the Disney company will jump in. And that's been the history with similar projects. I think we'll see support, financial support from the Disney company once they realize that we really are going to make this happen. And we're in touch with the company.
Dan, thank you for joining me. Dan will be presenting Walt Disney's Missouri at our Union branch on Thursday, June 12th at 6 p.m. You can register by visiting scenicregional.org/events. Thanks,
And we'll
Dan.
have pictures. We'll have pictures, not just me sitting here talking. We'll have photos, images to go with this. I really enjoy doing these presentations, and I think people enjoy hearing them. So
Great. Thank you so much.
thank you, Stephen.
My next guest is Georgia Payne. She is a master quilter from Washington State. She will be presenting Quilts of the Underground Railroad virtually at our St. Clair branch on Tuesday, June 17th at 6 p.m. Georgia, thanks for joining me today.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me, Stephen.
Well, let's get started. Let's start by having you talk about how you became interested in quilting in general.
Okay. Well, I started first sewing. My mom taught me how to sew at a very young age, and I grew up sewing and making clothes and doll clothes and you name it. And it was only probably in the last 15 years or so that I became interested in quilting. I had made baby quilts, lots of them, but for some reason I didn't consider that quilting, maybe because of the size. So then when I started getting interested in making larger quilts, bed-size quilts, I really enjoyed the process, the creating, and I was just hooked. So I've been doing it for a while now.
So, before we talk about Quilt's relationship with the Underground Railroad, while this is really sad we have to do this, just to make sure everyone knows what we're talking about, can you talk a little bit about what the Underground Railroad was?
Yes. Well, the Underground Railroad was a network, if you will, of black and white abolitionists, people that opposed slavery on moral grounds and people that opposed it just because of the nature of it. And it became known as the Underground Railroad. And of course, the most famous conductor that we know of is Harriet Tubman, who herself was a slave, a former slave. She escaped and she saved her earnings working as a maid and as a cook, and then she returned to the South to help free her sister and her sister's children. And she eventually led her whole family to freedom. It's said that she's made over 15 trips and 200 people to freedom. But she didn't do that alone. She had people that helped her along the way.
And of course, the Underground Railroad wasn't an actual railroad, like you mentioned. It was really kind of a bunch of, I guess, houses people could stay at along the way while they were trying to escape slavery into the North. I guess it was all through word of mouth, and we're going to talk a little bit about the quilts potentially as ways that people knew the route. Basically, is that accurate, or were there other
Yes,
ways people knew
yes.
the route?
There was sympathetic people along the way, and I'm not sure how they all connected or found each other, but they did, and they aided the slaves in many ways, not just housing them and hiding them, but also providing clothing for them so that they wouldn't stand out when they went into the crossroad towns. So they could easily transition from the community or the town that they were in to the ships that were waiting for them to take them to Canada.
Now, all the information you present in your program is, or most of it, is from a book called Hidden in Plain View. Can you
Mhm.
talk a little bit about that book and how it relates quilts to the Underground Railroad?
Right. Actually, when I became interested in quilting, I had seen a book and heard of a book by Eleanor Burns, who is from the Quilt in a Day kingdom, I'll say. She's very popular, very prolific quilter. And she did this book called The Underground Railroad Sampler. And in that book were all these blocks, how to make the blocks and what they meant. And that's what really got me started with this quilt. This was one that I wanted to make because I was interested in it. I'd always heard of the Underground Railroad, had no idea really what these blocks all meant. So I started with this sampler quilt. And in the book, Eleanor's book, she received her information from the Hidden in Plain View book. So that's how I first became aware of that book. And of course, after hearing about it, I wanted to read it for myself. So it's a very interesting story that's told to Jacqueline Tobin and Raymond DeBard by Daniels. So it's just a great story. It's a family. It's a story that was passed down through her family. So I know there's a lot of controversy around the book, but I found it fascinating and totally believable.
So what was the theory in the book exactly? Could you tell us about a little bit about that in terms of what it was saying was going on with the quilts?
Yeah, she's saying that there were quilt codes that were used and different quilts that were used, that were created, that were hung out for the slaves to see, to advise them to get ready, pack your belongings and things that you're going to take with you. Just a very, very fascinating story. The quilt starts with a block called the monkey wrench, and the monkey wrench was on the plantation was the blacksmith. And this is a person who knew the lay of the land because oftentimes he was loaned out from one plantation to another. So he knew the lay of the land and could aid them in how to escape and which routes to get started, how to get started. So a lot of times, and I don't know how Harriet Tubman became connected with the plantations or how she got the word out that she was going to make another trip. But the story says that these quilts were used in getting that message out. They would be hung on a fence or hung on a clothesline. Each step along the way, get your materials ready, get your baskets ready. It's time to go. So all of these quilts had a meaning.
And the symbols, we those people who are familiar with quilts, quilts have different patterns on them. People put different imagery on quilts. And as you
Mhm.
mentioned in the book, he was talking about how different symbols, which they also, I guess, referred to as codes, meant different things to the slaves that were trying to escape. So can you
Right.
talk a little bit about the meaning behind some of the other symbols on these quilts?
Well, in the book, Hidden in Plain View, there is a key that
Oh,
is
okay.
used to explain the different patterns in the book. Like I said, the first one started with the monkey wrench to get
Hmm.
started, get going, ready on your way. But there was a code to the quilts. It says the monkey wrench turns the wagon wheel toward Canada on a bare paws trail to the crossroads. Once they got to the crossroads, they dug a log cabin on the ground. Shoefly told them to dress up in cotton and satin bow ties, go to the cathedral church, get married, and exchange double wedding rings. Flying geese stay on the drunkard's path and follow the stars. So anybody that is a quilter will recognize those quilting names in this code. So that's where the story kind of begins and how they're advised along the way to begin the process. And there were many routes that were taken. I think Harriet Tubman was just one person that helped the slaves to escape because there were several routes, several different routes.
And the
Um,
quilts were also used to as maps as well. Is that what you said? It
They
showed.
were used as maps in the book, Hidden in Plain View. They talk about how some of the stitching in the quilts were used to direct people which way to go. There's so much that we can't know because it was very, very secret thing. You couldn't just tell anybody or just tell everybody. So, but those that were intent on escaping to freedom found this information. The book talks about them meeting in having secret meetings in graveyards sometimes, or maybe even at a church. So it was very secret. The language that they used, the symbols that they used, the stories that they told, even the songs that they sang had secret messages in them. One song that is very familiar to people is the song Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. And people, the plantation owners or others would think they were singing about heaven, but many times they were singing about escaping and they were singing about getting away. So just lots of secret codes. A lot of indigenous people, they have oral history and oral stories that are passed down from generation to generation. So that's not unusual. And that's why I don't find this story hard to believe, because I know that there are oral traditions and things that were passed down through generations. And the fact that there were secret ways to communicate and secret codes, that does not surprise me either. Now, the controversy is around the quilt blocks. Some people say, well, those blocks didn't exist at that time. I don't know. But other people, and it's been hard to document for the very reason, the secrecy that is around it. Miss
Because
McDaniel told her story, but they are saying, well, they haven't been able to find other people to corroborate or to say, and they haven't found those quilts. But I'll say too that quilts during that time were made to be used, and they were made out of whatever they could find around them. So they weren't the best quality. They may not have held up. They were hand sewn. They may not have held up over long, long periods of time. But there are quilts that exist that were made by slaves, known to have been made by slaves. And many times we don't realize what we have. We don't. Back then, they weren't thinking historically and for preservation like we do today. So the fact that there aren't a lot of those quilts around, I'm not surprised. I did find a story written about a museum in, I think it's the Louisiana State Museum in New Orleans, has some quilts on display that were made by slaves. And one of them
really,
even mentions the log cabin block and how it was used to help direct slaves. Now that was published long before this book, which has stirred up the controversy, but there are things that are documented before this book even came out.
the reason it's so controversial is, like you mentioned, it's entirely based on this one woman's family history and oral
Yeah,
history, Ozell Williams. And I
yeah.
guess historians haven't been able to find any corroborating evidence to support the story. But I think this concept of quilts and songs and other items being used to convey messages and to direct people is certainly not unprecedented, like you had mentioned.
Hmm.
This is certainly something that's gone on. So maybe it's only a matter of time before historians find some of that corroborating evidence of the quilts being used for this.
Yes, yes.
Because didn't you tell me before our interview that there are other examples of quilts being used for codes or something?
I did find an article that said that during the Revolutionary War, that quilt codes or barn quilts, which is a painted piece of wood of a
Hmm.
block, was put on barns, and it was used to let the soldiers know that this was a safe place to land. There was food, there was water,
Sure.
those kinds of things. So, if they were using these kind of symbols in the Revolutionary War, certainly they could have used something similar during the Civil War, during slavery, so to direct people. A lot of people have seen these little lawn jockeys,
Sure.
and maybe they were holding a lantern. Those certainly were used to direct people, saying if it was lit, this was a safe place to be or safe house. Lots of different things that were used to help direct people. And it is said that these quilts were hung either in a window or on a line, that this was a safe place to land. So I find the story fascinating. I find it very believable. Was it the exact quote codes that Ozella mentions? I can't say, but I have no doubt in my mind that there were codes, and maybe in many forms, not just quilts. But quilt would have been easy to hide in plain view, in
Hmm.
plain
Yeah.
sight.
It seems
And
like a very strange story to make up. Like there's no
yeah,
benefit to
there's no benefit
fabricating
to
a
making it
story.
up.
Yeah, there's no benefit to that for her or for her
Yeah.
family. So, well, Georgia, thanks again for joining me. This is a very fascinating topic. Once again, you'll be presenting Quilts of the Underground Railroad virtually at our St. Clair branch on Tuesday, June 17th at 6 p.m. People can register for that by visiting scenicregional.org/events. I'm sure the people attending the program will have plenty of questions about this. It's a very, like I said, a very interesting topic. Thanks so much,
Yeah.
Georgia.
Thank you.
Well, that wraps up the latest episode of Taking the Scenic Route, Scenic Regional Libraries podcast. I hope that you can join me again in 2 weeks when we release our next episode.